to our Zoom session of the history of Orkney Springs and Shrine Mont, 200 years of that. And at this time, I'd like to turn it over to our Shenandoah County Historical Society President, Barbara Adamson.
Thank you, Dennis. I want to note that we did have one other virtual program in September of 2020 about women's suffrage, and that was presented by Zach Hoddle, our county archivist. And prior to that, our last in-person program was in November of 2019. So even though we can't be in person, it's a relief. It's a relief to see a lot of faces. And one bonus of having a virtual program is that we can reach people who don't live nearby. And that's nice. It's very nice. I won't say anything about how many people were registered because Dennis he keeps mentioning numbers and they go up and up. It's well over 100.
130, Barbara, 130.
Okay. And I want to thank Kirk for doing the program and for Dennis and Edgar for working so very hard on this program. A couple of announcements, just like we would make if we were in person. Not many, though. Shenandoah County Heritage Day, our annual Heritage Day, was canceled last year, of course. And this year it'll be virtual on April the 17th. And I think Dennis is going to try to put on the screen a flyer that we have for Heritage Day so that you all can see the wonderful schedule of presentations that we're going to have. There it is.
Did you see it?
Oh.
Let me be back to share it with you. That'll work.
And you can go to
oh, beg your pardon.
Yeah, there'll be 5 lectures that day, and actually that's tonight. There'll be 5 lectures that day. One on our historic barns and agricultural legacy, starting at 10. At 11, there's vintage recipes and eating patterns with Bev Butterfield. At noon, Queen Street and Sunset Hills.
You and Bob don't know how well it's going at.
And by Marquita Mitchell. And at 1, we have unearthing the history of Fort Valley Manganese Mine.
I said you and Bob don't know how well you're doing
with Meg
at Mount Herman.
And at 2 o'clock, the Woodstock Reservoirs, a history of.
This is your host, Dennis Atwood. Excuse me, would you please mute until we're finished with our presentation video? Then Barbara Adamson, our Historical Society president, was letting you know. It should be on the share screen now, Barbara, is it?
Yeah, it is there. I would just watch out. You can go to our website. You'll be able to access our newsletter after April the 1st, and the schedule will be there if you've missed it tonight. And I'm sure you'll be able to check it out on Facebook.
This is posted, Barbara, excuse me, as a Facebook event.
On Facebook as well.
Facebook event.
And
okay.
We co-host this with the Shenandoah County Library Archives and our archivist, Zach Hoddle. So Zach and Dennis and John Adamson have been working hard to put together our Heritage Day this year. And the last thing I'll mention is that the historic courthouse is open for the season in Woodstock. We're open now Fridays and Saturdays from 11 to 4. And I will turn things back over to Dennis. Thank you. Thanks and welcome everybody for being here.
Thank you very much, Barbara. It looked like your technology cooperated. Again, I'm your host, Dennis Atwood. I'm on the board of the Shenandoah County Historical Society, and it's been my pleasure to work with Kirk Gibson and Edgar Lama to get this put together for you. This was actually proposed as a program for March of 2020. And then pandemic year happened. And I talked to Kirk on the phone and sent him texts during the year, but we didn't meet in person until February 9th of this year. And I always knew him as Kirk Gibson. But at this moment, I would ask you, please, if we could pause to observe a moment of silence for all of the too many who have passed due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Amen. Thank you very much. So here we are a year later after we first proposed to have this program. And there's 60 folks in the room so far, and I've got to keep admitting folks that are just arriving. Welcome to the late arrivals. So Kirk Gibson sent is a bio sketch for me to use tonight, yesterday, and that's when I learned that we have a gentleman whose birth certificate says Churchill J. Gibson IV. And Kirk is the Director of Development at Mont. He joined the Mont staff in 2008 after serving for 17 years at the National Alliance to End Homelessness in Washington, D.C. Most recently as the Executive Director and Chief Operating Officer. Kirk has a long history with Mont, having spent the summers in his youth on the mountain when his father, the Reverend Churchill Gibson Jr., was chaplain from 1964 to 1983. Kirk's great uncle, Dr. Edmund Woodward, whom you'll hear a lot more about during our program, founded Mont. Kirk holds a BS degree from Randolph-Macon College and a master's degree in business administration from the College of William and Mary. So I will now start our program video. And again, I will say I'm still learning every day about the technology. We had this set up to also go to Facebook Live, but Facebook has new requirements on their end that we hadn't experienced and hadn't tested. So welcome to all 59 folks who are here. Now let me say how we'll proceed from here. We'll show our program video. You may enter questions or comments, or you want to share anything, in the chat feature in Zoom. If you're not familiar with the chat feature, it is along your control bar just to the left of share screen. And when you have the ability to address whomever you wish, there's a choice of everyone, or you can put a person's name in there if you want to chat with someone else who's in the room. We will, at the end of our video, we'll do the questions that are there, and then we'll go around the room if we have time, and you can raise your hand, and on our 3 or 4 screens, if I can find you, we'll call on you. So let me share my screen for our video. Thank you for attending tonight. I'm going to let her roll.
My name is Kirk Gibson. I'm the Director of Development at Mont, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about the building of the Cathedral Shrine of the Transfiguration in Orkney Springs and the beginning of Mont. On August 6, 1925, Bishop William Campbell Brown consecrated this place where I am right now as the Cathedral Shrine of the Transfiguration. And since that date, this has been the actual cathedral of the Episcopal Diocese of Virginia, even though our seat is really in Richmond, Virginia. Now, how that came to be is an interesting story, and why we are here in Orkney Springs goes back to really the late 1890s. Robert Atkinson Gibson was consecrated the Bishop of Virginia in 1897, and then in 1902 began service as the actual bishop. And during that first 5 years of his episcopate, he was really interested in finding a place that was quiet and cool and away from Richmond for his families to have summer vacations. And somebody suggested that he come to Orkney Springs and stay in the Stribling Select Boarding House, which is in the actual public square of the original village. And he and his family came and stayed for a few summers in the Stribling boarding house. And then in 1900, a house came for sale way up the hill from the town of Orkney. It was called Tanglewood. And he purchased that property in 1900 for about $1,200. And from that day on, served his work in the summertime in Orkney Springs in Tanglewood. And we're going to pan over real quick to look at Tanglewood, which we now call Gibson Cottage. And that is that large red building to my left. It was a much smaller cottage at the time the bishop bought it. The porches weren't on it or anything like that. It was just a quaint mountain cottage, but it served his purposes until he died in 1919. And then in 1919, his son-in-law, the Reverend Dr. Edmund Woodward, purchased the property from the estate so the family could still use it as their summer retreat. Now, Dr. Woodward, in and of himself, is a very interesting character and a visionary. Early in his career, he served after finishing medical school as a missionary to China. And in 1903, he went to China to build a hospital in the province of Anqing, and built that hospital and ran it from 1903 until 1907. And then in 1907, he came back to Virginia and went to the Virginia Theological Seminary to become ordained as an Episcopal priest. In that 3-year window, Dr. Woodward met Bishop Gibson's daughter, Frances, and in 1910 married her, and then promptly took her back to China for some more missionary work until her health required that they come back to Virginia in 1914. And then from 1914 until the bishop died, Dr. Woodward would serve in many capacities in the Diocese of Virginia to help his father-in-law out, including probably most notably the building of Grace Episcopal Church in the Plains, Virginia, which is another stone building built from local rocks the farmers brought in Fauquier County. Now, after the bishop died in 1919 and Dr. Woodward acquired the property, he began to clear the mess of woods and rocks that earned Tanglewood its name. And with some of the trees that he knocked down in the early 1920s, he built the log cabin, which we'll pan over to real quick, and lived in that log cabin in the summers while the family would still summer in Tanglewood. And if you look at the log cabin, the front 2 rooms, where the porch is and the little bedroom to its right, were the original cabin. And then later on, he built the additional parts of the building and moved in there full time. In 1924, Dr. Woodward began to develop a vision of a church building in Orkney Springs, right here on the Tanglewood property. And he and Frances decided the location right where I'm standing would be a perfect place to build that church. For Bishop Gibson, it was a very special place. It's where he would come and meditate and pray while he was staying here during the summers. And so in 1924, what Dr. Woodward began to build, using the stones that he pulled down the mountain, was the chancel here behind me. And the way he built it was using good old arch technology around a wooden form. And he finished that form in the fall of 1924, just as you see here, and left the form underneath the rocks to cure all winter, 1924 and 25. And then in the spring of 1925, they slowly pulled out the wooden form to see how the stone structure would hold up. I have an aunt who died recently, well, it died in the last 10 years, but was around 90 years old, and remembers as a child watching them pull the form out and everybody holding their breath and anxiety that it maybe wouldn't hold. But so far it's held up pretty well. And then in 1925, what Dr. Woodward finished was the frontal here of the cathedral and the bell tower. And the way he built every piece that you see here was literally taking the rocks as he found them up the mountain, sometimes down, dragging them over here, and then fitting them in place as best they would fit. And the way he built the bell tower was basically, there was a ramp right here that went up to a scaffolding, and his help would roll the rocks up to him as he would work around the bell tower, putting it together one rock at a time, moving up. And then, as you see, there are 3 tiers. Inside is a vaulted ceiling up to the 2nd tier, and then he finished the bell tower up there. And you just have to imagine him rolling the rocks up and then placing them in without any cranes or even a block and tackle, I think. It really was just making things fit. And then he finished the frontal here using these huge stones that you see as the pulpit and the lectern over there. And then the font here, which we have covered up for the winter ice, basically was a large stone that legend has it was used by the Indians to carve out, to grind corn. But Dr. Woodward's notes talk about how it took him 5 days to actually chisel out the font as we use it today. Now, there are some important symbols that Dr. Woodward built into the cathedral that I like to mention, because his vision of church and the church community was very global and inclusive. And he put some symbols in this cathedral to reflect that. One symbol that maybe we'll look at in a minute is a piece of cast iron bell in the entranceway to the bell tower. And on that cast iron bell are the Chinese symbols for Holy Catholic Church. Not Roman Catholic Church, but little c, a universal church for everybody to come and worship. And also at the floor, in the base of the chancel here, where the altar is a brick that is unique. It comes from the first brick church built in Jamestown. Dr. Woodward acquired 3 of those bricks somehow. One at the foot of the altar here, one at the foot of the altar in the shelter chapel behind me, and one in the hearth of the rectory's fireplace. And those 3 bricks, as I said, came from the original stone brick structure at Jamestown. And for the Episcopal Church, that's an important symbol, because it was in 1607 that the first Holy Communion was celebrated in the Jamestown colony in 1607. And that was the beginning of the Episcopal Church, that branch of the Anglican Communion for Virginia. And then the last symbol I always like to talk about is up in the chancel itself. Hopefully you can see that the 3rd stone up is a little darker. There are 6 stones on either side of the keystone to the entire chancel. And those will symbolize the 12 apostles, 6 on each side with Christ as the keystone. But the 3rd one, being darker, Dr. Woodward would always say reflected Judas and the dark side that he presents. Now, the cathedral is used every Sunday when we're open at Shrine Mont, which is mid-April through November, for a number of services. In a traditional summer, not like we've had the last couple, typically about 13,000 people will come and worship in our cathedral. It is the bishop's seat, so the Bishop of Virginia will come and hold services here from time to time. But usually it is whoever's coming to stay with us for the summer or for a specific weekend will hold their own services here in the cathedral, sometimes 3, 4, or even 5 in a given Sunday. We do have people who have been baptized and are members of our cathedral, and we also have a number of weddings and funerals that are held from time to time. So that's a little bit about our cathedral and how it got started. So after Dr. Woodward built the cathedral and it was consecrated on August 6, 1925, he began to bring to fruition his vision of what Shrine Mont might be. And at that point, he made an agreement with the Bishop of Virginia to deed the entire property over to the bishop and to the diocese once he had finished it upon his death, which was actually in 1948. And the one caveat he made with the bishop in that relationship is that the Diocese of Virginia would never have direct control of Shrine Mont, that it would only be under the bishop's direct control. And from that time forward, Shrine Mont's relationship with the diocese was always one of operational independence. And still to this day, we receive no subsidies from the church in our operations, nor can the diocese sell us out from ourselves should they ever need money. Having said that, Dr. Woodward began to build what is now Shrine Mont. First by finishing the cathedral area itself. And in the 30s, he finished up the backside or the shelter chapel so that our parishioners would have a place to worship in the rain. And while the shrine itself and the cathedral are all dedicated to the loving memory of Bishop Robert Atkinson Gibson, Dr. Woodward's father-in-law. The shelter chapel and everything in that part of the cathedral area are all dedicated in loving memory of the Woodward family and all that it meant to him in his growing up. So as I mentioned earlier, in 1919, he purchased Gibson Cottage, which they called Tanglewood at the time, and then he moved full-time into the rectory to build Shrine Mont. And then he began to build the cottages that would make up his original vision of having 120 acres, serving 120 people, with an endowment of $120,000. And his whole idea about that 120 goes back to the biblical story in the book of Acts, when the 120 gathered to select Matthias as the 12th apostle after Judas. And those 120 people gathered together, did some good work in selecting Matthias, and then went out into the world to spread the good news. And that's what Dr. Woodward's vision was of Shrine Mont, that people would come here to recharge their battery and do some good work, but then go back into the world to spread the good news. And to build 120 beds for those 120 people, he first began to build that large log cabin behind me, which was named Crenshaw Lodge, in honor of Fanny Crenshaw, who was the aunt of one of the residents in Orkney Springs, the McElroy family. And they wanted to give money in her honor, so he built Crenshaw for them and for his first guests. He then built a number of cottages and buildings along this side of what was the original Gibson property, and then began to acquire property to finish up the 120 acres. The first piece of land he bought for Shrine Mont was actually from the Orkney Springs Hotel Corporation, which was down in Orkney Springs, and which we'll talk about in great detail later. But he purchased about 100 acres of land from the Hotel Corporation that comprised all of Spring Mountain, once known as Yellow Spring Mountain, and today called Spring Mountain. It really was his vision of that mount. And on top of that mountain, he put a cross that we still have as a platform for folks to come and observe the mountains in the valley, and then started calling it Shrine Mountain from that cross on top of the mountain. After that purchase, he bought a piece of land along the eastern side of the Gibson property from a Judge Newman for $1,200. It had what we call Peterkin Cottage, which we'll look at down on the main central circle. Also a recital hall, and then a lot of property on which Dr. Woodward built 5 or 6 additional cottages and then later meeting spaces. And then through the rest of his time until he died in '48, what Dr. Woodward acquired were a few of the homes on the public circle, which we'll look at in another part of this conversation. And those cottages, combined with what he built up here, gave him his 120 beds and his 120 acres. And he never had the opportunity to raise the $120,000 for the endowment. We're still working on that. Mrs. Woodward died in 1945. And then in 1948, in February, Dr. Woodward died. And at that point, one of his chief lieutenants, Wilmer Mumaw, took over as the administrator, as appointed by the bishop. And then in 1950, the bishop asked Wilmer Mumaw to serve as the director of Shrine Mont, which he did until he retired in 1988. I'm here in the village circle of Orkney Springs to talk a little bit about the history of Orkney Springs and Shrine Mont. Long before Shrine Mont was established in 1925, and even long before the Orkney Springs Hotel was established in the 1850s, 60s, and 70s, the village of Orkney Springs really sprung up right here where I'm standing. Starting in 1808, a Major Peter Higgins, Revolutionary War veteran, acquired this property from the estate of Mary McDonald through her brother, who created the transaction to sell the property. Isaac Height was his name, and that's known throughout the Shenandoah County. But Major Higgins built the original town in a square right where I'm standing, basically laying quarter-acre lots around the exterior of an inner courtyard. And in that courtyard were the 4 original springs of Orkney Springs. We still have 2 here. This building next to me holds the Tea Spring, and a little further to the east is the actual Orkney Spring, or what was called back in the day the Chalybeate Spring. There are also 2 other springs in the courtyard. Right here was probably what was known as the Lutheran Spring, and a little further up was the Methodist Spring. The town initially was laid out, as I said, in quarter-acre lots. None of these buildings around here now are original. The oldest building we know of in Orkney Springs is actually a log cabin, which is behind me to my left, way back up on the hill. There was probably a row of those cabins built in the 1800s at some point before the Civil War. After the Civil War, most of these cottages around here were built, and over the years these have been acquired by Mont to be a part of our facility that we rent out in the summer. 2 of the cottages over here are actually still privately held, and the residents do come up and spend their summers with their families, which is a lot of fun. The original town name of Orkney Springs probably comes about because the original purchaser of the property from Lord Fairfax, Dr. John MacDonald, came from Scotland and has ties to the Orkney Isles. There are some other rumors of different origins of why this is called Orkney Springs, but be that as it is, we are now Orkney Springs, Virginia. Interestingly, in the 1830s, as the town was actually incorporated, it was incorporated as Van Burenville. Apparently, Martin Van Buren came and spoke to the residents in this part of the county at that time, and they were very enthusiastic and decided to name the village for him. But 50 years later, they tried to change the name back to Orkney Springs legally, but the governor at the time vetoed that bill. Despite that, the residents took on the name of Orkney Springs again, which suits it very well to the resorts and the springs that were very popular starting in the 1850s. We are now at the furthest southwestern part of the original town of Orkney Springs, and behind me is Stribling Cottage. The large brown structure is a significant building in Mont's history because, as I mentioned earlier in the talk, when Bishop Gibson was looking for a summer retreat in 1900, he was sent to stay in the Stribling Select boarding house. That actually is not the same structure we see here. That burnt down in 1915, and this one replaced it. But the Striblings moved to Orkney Springs in the 1840s. At least that's the story. And it was because one of their family was desperately ill and sickly and needed to get away to the mountains and to the healthier air. And the story is that she lived on to be almost 90 years old once she moved into Orkney Springs, and her family continued to run the boarding house up until the 1970s, when Miss Lucy Kimball, who had inherited the property, gave it to Mont in her estate plans. But Bishop Gibson and his family stayed here really until they bought Tanglewood in 1900 every summer. And another story about Stribling is that later in life, another bishop of Virginia, Bishop Arthur Selden Lloyd, also came and stayed with his family in the Stribling Select boarding house for a few summers to be with the Gibson family. I'm standing here in Mont, in probably the hub of the original 120 acres that Dr. Woodward built. Behind me is what is now called Tucker Lodge, and it was actually a number of different buildings put together over the years. Dr. Woodward purchased the original property from a Judge Newman in the 1930s, And that piece of land included Peterkin Cottage, which is just over here to my right, part of the building behind me going all the way up the hill. The building that you see with the bell on it was actually a studio where one of the previous owners had a daughter who wanted to be an opera singer, and he built her that studio so she would have a place to sing that was far enough that he wouldn't have to hear it. And Dr. Woodward turned that studio into a community center, a refectory for the guests of Shrine Mont to eat in the summer, and a community center for the residents of Orkney Springs in the wintertime. And then off of that building, he built the building with the chimney, which we now call Brown Hall, and over the years, additional dining rooms that now can seat up to 300 people, family style, when Shrine Mont's fully operational. The large annex over behind me to my left is a building built in 1940 called Art Hall. And Dr. Woodward acquired through the estate of his great uncle all his uncle's artwork. John Douglas Woodward, who was the uncle, was a prolific artist, starting his career as an illustrator for various magazines and books in the late 1800s, and then later, after acquiring a significant inheritance, did a number of oil paintings of his favorite landscapes in Europe and the United States. And upon his death, Dr. Woodward suggested to Mrs. Woodward, his aunt, that he would build a space to house the art, since she had no place to put it, and he would have additional meeting space. And so in 1940, using funds that she gave specifically for the care of the art, he built Art Hall, and that still stands as a museum, and we are the curators of 78 pieces of John Douglas Woodward's art and all the illustrations that were made over his career. Now, after Dr. Woodward died in 1948, the Bishop of Virginia asked Wilmer Mumau to be the director of Shrine Mont. Actually, to be the administrator in 1948 and then the director in 1950. That was a significant change for Shrine Mont for the good. The Mumau family were residents of Orkney Springs, and Wilmer, the director, had served at the hotel in various capacities and worked with Dr. Woodward through the entire building of Shrine Mont in the early years. Wilmer served as the director from 1950 until he retired in 1988, spending probably the last 5 or 10 years of his time at Shrine Mont overseeing the renovation of the Orkney Springs Hotel property, which we'll talk about in a moment. Upon Wilmer's retirement, the bishop asked Wilmer's son Dick to take over as the director and Dick's brother John to serve as assistant director. And they served in the leadership of Shrine Mont until 12 years ago, when Dick and John retired and Dick's son Kevin took the reins on as the director of Shrine Mont. And so it's been 3 generations of Mumau's who have taken care of and provided this stewardship to keep us going for the last almost 100 years, coming in 1925.
I said there was Wilmer and Nellie.
So after the town of Van Burenville was built and incorporated in 1833, the medicinal qualities of the waters in Virginia were beginning to be noted around the East Coast. And there are a number of small hotels built in Orkney Springs in the 1840s and 1850s to kind of serve that clientele. And as the clientele grew, there needed to be a larger facility as a resort. And in the early 1850s, the Orkney Springs Resort Incorporated, with many different names, began to build the facility that you see here now. To my right is the Maryland House, which was the first building of the Orkney Springs Resort Hotel. It was built in the early 1850s over a number of years. And then the building immediately behind the Virginia House, which is the large structure behind me, that building is called the Pennsylvania House, was built, along with a row of cottages called Jersey Row, perpendicular to the main road. Those were all built probably in the 1850s and early before the Civil War. And then all construction ceased during the course of the war between the states. And then in 1865, they began construction again. And in earnest, they began to build in the early 1870s the large structure behind me, which we call the Virginia House. And the story, as I have heard it, is that they about finished the Virginia House in early 1873, when a large wet snow in that spring literally collapsed the entire structure. And they had to start over again, building what I think is a smaller version of the Virginia House. When looking at artist renderings of the time, the Virginia House had a little different facade and looked a little bigger. And I think that might have been the first one. This one, which is 4 stories tall and has very, very high ceilings and accommodations for hundreds of people in the back, was finished in 1875. And from 1875 until really the turn of the century, this was a very popular resort up and down the East Coast. The New York Times wrote about it a couple of times, specifically about how easy it was for the Mid-Atlantic region folks to get here. A simple train ride to Newmarket or Mount Jackson, followed by a 3-hour stagecoach ride into Orkney Springs, on what was then called the Howard's Lick Turnpike, I believe. From the turn of the century up until the Depression, it was still a very popular resort, but not quite as financially sound as it was earlier on. And then after the Depression, this resort unfortunately began to see a downturn into the 1970s, where a large portion of the Virginia House on the upper stories were condemned, and many of the other rooms and buildings were barely habitable. One gem that came out of the 1950s and 60s and early 70s of the Orkney Springs Hotel really came about with the conductors' workshops that were held here by Dr. Lurt. In July and August, he would bring in conductors from all over the country and literally have workshops to help them learn how to conduct orchestras. And the story and the legend is that he would use the second floor of the Virginia House in the ladies' parlor to teach those conductors' workshops. And people would begin to sit on the lawn and listen to the workshops as they went on. And as I understand it, somebody finally went up to Dr. Lurt one day and asked if those workshops could at least play one song all the way through. And that began the Shenandoah Valley Music Festival. And we have hosted the Shenandoah Valley Music Festival since 1962 on the hotel property, and Shrinemont, since we acquired the hotel in '79, has continued to host that gem of the Shenandoah Valley. As I said, the hotel itself was falling apart literally in the 60s and 70s. And also the 1,200 acres that the hotel property consisted of was constantly discussed as being for sale to other developers. For Shrinemont, that was a definite threat because our place apart without the buffer of the hotel property would be just devastated. And after negotiations that probably lasted in excess of 10 years, Shrinemont and the then proprietor, Buddy Portlock, came to an agreement that Shrinemont would buy the entire property, all the buildings and all the land for an amount of money, and that the acquisition of the property would carry no interest on the loan. The Portlocks basically allowed Shrinemont to purchase the property to be payable over a number of years without interest, which enabled Shrinemont to acquire the property, and it also enabled the Portlocks to get what they thought they deserved for the value of the land and the property. So that happened in 1979. And when Shrinemont took over the facility, there were a number of conversations that had to be had at that time about the disposition of the buildings on the property. Again, our primary concern at Shrinemont was the acquisition of the property to protect Shrinemont from development. And what would happen next with the hotels was a conversation regarding the need for renovation, the need for Shrinemont to take out debt for the first time, and the amount of work that would have to be done to make it a feasible project. So in the early 80s, Shrinemont did some minor renovations to the Pennsylvania house and Maryland house to make them livable, but the conversation with the Shrinemont board really got to a head in the mid-1980s when it was clear that a large debt would need to be incurred to renovate the property as it should be renovated. And I am told that the board did have a vote to recommend to the bishop that Shrinemont take out the necessary loans to do the work, but that vote by the board was only a one-person margin. And it was that important a decision and that close a decision to make it happen. But once the decision was made to renovate the buildings, Shrinemont took off full force in a complete renovation, starting with the Virginia house in the mid-1980s. Literally jacking it up off the ground at first to renovate the entire foundation below, which was quite a sight to see it up in the air on jacks. And then later, after settling it back down and wrapping it up in plastic, the entire structure in a plastic bag to fumigate and get rid of all the bugs. And then after that work was done and everything was leveled off, they really were able to retain the entire inside of the building as it had initially been built. The guts of the building were all wood and were sound, and they used those as the foundation and the framework for the renovation. Through the 1990s, they finished renovating the Pennsylvania house, all the cottages, and finally the Maryland house. That was completed in 1992. And all the hotel rooms were completely gutted to have private bathrooms and the amenities that people come to expect, even in the 1980s and 1990s. And with that renovation, Shrinemont kind of took on its new role as not just a quaint little retreat center for 300 people, but a conference center serving up to 600 people. Our food services, each dining room will now hold 300 people in one seating. And we have had conferences and groups of all sizes and all types. While we are a retreat center of the Episcopal Church in the Diocese of Virginia, we are also a conference center open to anybody who wants to come and use the facility. We have no rules about who or what kinds of groups can come in, and we welcome family reunions, secular groups, large groups and small groups. We have our core camps for the youth. We have our own conferences for the church. We have about 120 parishes that come on retreat. And that's a major part of our business. But since we were established in 1979 as the current Shrinemont, we have welcomed all kinds of groups and continue to work with the tourism industry in Shenandoah County and up and down the valley to welcome anybody who wants to come and use the facility. One important thing to note about the Orkney Springs Hotel property is that in 1976, it was placed on the National Register of Historic Places. And many think it's just the large Virginia house that actually is on the National Register, when actually it's the entire property designated as American Resort, a unique historical perspective reflecting a time where you just don't see these buildings anywhere anymore. We are very proud of that aspect of us. And as you look behind me and see a better view of the what was then Jersey Row, what we call the Cottage Row of houses, the Pennsylvania house and the Maryland house in the forefront with the large Virginia house behind it, you really get an appreciation for the historical value that we have here in Orkney Springs with the resort, and how seriously Mont takes our stewardship of the property. When Mont was established as a nonprofit organization in the 1980s, our own status, not the church's, it was for three purposes. The custodian of the cathedral shrine, which we've talked about, the work we have done in the arts with the Woodward Collection and the Shenandoah Valley Music Festival, and a number of camps for young people in the arts. And then finally, for our work in historic preservation in keeping this facility up and functioning as a vital part of Shenandoah County.
Well, how about that video, folks? Hope you enjoyed that. We'll soon get to questions and answers. Thank you so much. And this fourth time I've seen it, and every time it's just as good. So what I would say from learning all that information is we now have the inside story of Gibson, Woodward, and Mumma Incorporated. I want to give a special thanks again to our videographer, Edgar Lamy III, and for the photos that were used in the presentation. So let me get to find Kirk in the room here. There you are. Are you unmuted?
I am.
Okay, you're on, I think, screen 2 at the bottom on my computer. So thanks again for all 62 people that joined up with us. And if I may, I will go to the top of the chat and pick up on our questions. First, let me note that indeed our Facebook Live feed over did not work for reasons we need to study and understand. I did post an apology note there. We are recording this session, and we will post it sometime tomorrow. Technical note, someone said the whole video seems a bit blurry. Let me explain that the Edgar Lamy's camera is an HD camera. My computer screen is HD, so we just have to say that it's the vagaries of internet signaling, especially over long distances. Okay, Sean Winetta posted. He says, "Good evening, everybody," and you guys can see this too. It's in the chat feature. As I was growing up and going to summer camp at Mont, I always heard stories that the Virginia House had served as a hospital or convalescent home for Civil War soldiers. Is there any truth to that, or is it just a tale that counselors told young campers? He doesn't name the counselors. Okay, so do we have an answer for that, Kirk?
Well, Edgar actually answered the question in the chat. One, to clarify, that the Maryland House was the only one that was built before the Civil War started. Everything else was built after the Civil War. And we've seen no proof that it was ever used in any way as a hospital or convalescent center. We have seen letters and some correspondence reflecting some troop movement through the valley to get on the other side of North Mountain to do some things, specifically in the 1863 New Year's Eve. There was one troop, that cavalry troop of Confederacy, that stayed over because of an ice storm. But other than that, we've not seen anything that shows that there was actually any kind of, is way off the beaten path of the main battlefields. And I don't think they'd haul a lot of people out to Orkney Springs from the Valley Pike.
Let me follow up on that one. Thank you.
Ron has something to say too.
Ron, go next. Let me get, are you unmuted, Ron?
Ron's muted. Ron, you're muted.
Can you unmute yourself, Ron, or could I have to do it? I'm trying to find him.
Must be. Now I am. Okay. There is an area on the other side of Spring Mountain called the Bradford Fields. And I assume Bradford was the proprietor. And I assumed that that was a place where they pastured horses and so on, that it had maybe grew some crops. And it was also used as a, what do you call them? An R&R place for horses. So the horses that needed to be cavalry horses and so on, that needed recuperation would be brought out here and pastured there.
Thank you for that follow-up, Ron. So the use as a hospital of some of the Shrymont buildings, if I may say, might be Sean horse pucky, but the horses benefiting from that there would probably be true. And I would say, to my knowledge, the closest known and well-known hospital facility was in Mount Jackson. There was a Confederate hospital there, and that's been documented by, I believe, the Mount Jackson Museum folks. Okay, we hope that was an adequate answer. I couldn't find Sean on my 3 screens to make sure that that was going that. Okay, let's see. And Jennifer Newland, thanks for saying your favorite place on earth. Always happy to be there, and I hope you can access it easily from your residence. All right, Charles Coward has asked, what about the burning of the cross on Yellow Spring Mountain in the 1950s?
That's true. There was a much larger structure built. I don't know if it was the original one that Dr. Woodward built or a later one, but one was built much larger that did burn down in the 1950s. And the one that we have up there now is probably the 3rd generation of crosses that we've had to rebuild them a couple of times just because they fall down, but not with people on them. But we need to, keep them sturdy and strong. And so I'd say that the one we have up there now is at least the 2nd or 3rd generation after the big one that burnt down. And I do have, Charles, I'll share it with you. I've got some pictures of the original cross because there was a large building kind of structure actually beneath it at the time.
Okay, let's see, don't know the full name, but REK 96 asks, is the art house open to the public?
Art Hall is open when Shrymont is open, April through November, and people can walk in and take a look. The facility is typical of a 1940s building. It's got poor lighting, and we haven't talked a lot about it, but Shrymont is turning 100 years old in 1925 or 2025, and one of the projects that we hope to complete as part of that centennial is a renovation of Art Hall to make it a deserving facility for the art that we have in it.
I hope that's a adequate answer, and I need to intervene here because Kirk, you give me a great segue to mention that in addition to our County Heritage Day, April 17th coming up, again, that flyer is on our Facebook page. That first, we had our 2017 Heritage Day in person in the Virginia House, 3rd floor, 2nd floor. It was spectacular in the ballroom, and it was just really crowded and really enjoyed it. But you mentioned the 200th of Shrymont, et cetera. The county of Shenandoah County, originally Dunmore County, is celebrating its 250th anniversary in 2022. There'll be a lot more information coming, but if you have a 2022 calendar handy or a scratch pad, there'll be events year long for the 250th. Original Dunmore County changed to Shenandoah in 1778. Can we view this video later? Absolutely. We're recording it and we will post it on Facebook and in other venues, perhaps in YouTube, and we'll let you know about that. We are recording the session. Person asked, the Major Peter Higgins, who purchased the property from Isaac Height, the brother and estate administrator for Mary McDonald, Mary Height McDonald, about his grave. is there a grave known for him?
I've not seen one. And I haven't really searched for one either. That's a great question. And there are resources, but Ron, have you ever seen the grave for him?
There's not, I've never seen very much about him at all.
No.
Okay, research assignment for those who are interested. We'll follow up later. Might see what is in the Shenandoah room at the county library. A lot of cemetery information there, and maybe Library of Virginia and records that way. Thanks for that question. What hours is Shrine Mont open April to November?
Well, we're open 24/7. We'll begin to welcome guests April 9th this year. And by making a reservation, anybody can come up and stay. Just realize that our reservation, our fees all include 3 meals a day. So we really do take care of you when you come up. If you'd like to just come up and walk around and make a have a meal with us, that's certainly welcome. Just give us a call and so we know that you're coming. And we have a standard menu every weekend that's been time tested for about 85 years. A lot of good comfort food. And then, so if you want to visit, we'd love to have you.
Okay, and do visit their website. A lot of great information. It's, in my opinion, a very elegant, attractive website. And thereon, when you're going to register for your visit, there's a list of more than 14 activities that the guests can engage in. So that's quite the deal. And I'm not a compensated agent for Shrine Mont. I'm just passing along information that I found. Let's see. Donna Schrum let us know, back up to some Civil War history. McNeil's Rangers, who were Confederate Rangers out of what became West Virginia, I believe, used the route over the mountain to cross past Shrine Mont and into Mount Jackson. There is a historical marker in Mims Bottom about McNeil's Rangers' last action in the Civil War. Ron, do you have any implication on that? Okay, we're using Ron as our other resident. Okay, thank you. Thanks for that question. All right, Kathy has asked, is it true that German POWs were housed at Shrine Mont in World War II?
I've never heard that.
All right, what I know from just being around here a long time, and I won't reveal my full age, but almost everybody's younger than I am. There were German POWs at the Shenandoah golf resort.
Is that right?
Barbara? No.
Yeah, actually they were Italian, and
Thank
they were
you.
at Shenandoah, yes.
Italian, got to get the right country. Thank you so much. There's no legacy that I know of any Italian menus at the Miller Grill, but at any rate. Okay, that right now, I hope I didn't miss anybody. That finishes our list of questions. Again, visit shrinemont.com, just straightforward. What was Major Higgins' full name? Peter. I have Peter Higgins. Purchased Isaac Height. Being that it was 1800, I'll ask Adamson's to clarify. That might have been Isaac Height Jr. was the executor of Mary Height McDonald's estate. And of course, Dr. John McDonald got his land from Lord Fairfax. Again, let me put up, if I can, I can work it this way. There's 3 screens here. Is anybody else on the screen? We're sharing with Jonelle and Cynthia Sumner and Janet Wagner. Anybody on that page where I can't assume that you guys have the same page I have. That's another feature. But if you have another question, raise your hand and I'll try to find you. If you have another question or comment, I'll go. It's my first screen and second screen. Hello, everybody again. Third screen. As a fellow from the southern part of the United States told me as I worked in my government career, this many people, it's all you all. Not y'all, it's all you all. But again, thanks to, we have Dwight Brown, and are you unmuted? Can you-
I think so. You tell
Yes,
me.
you are. Please go ahead.
Hey, Dwight, how are
I
you?
just want to thank you and say
This
how wonderful
Cannon,
this
this
has
Cannon
been.
Brown, Cannon Brown.
It is.
Very good.
And my wife, Kathy. I served at Trinity in Arlington, and then Clark Parish, Grace and St. Mary's in Berryville, and retired in 2016. I was first at Mont as a seminary student working at Trinity, and that would have been the fall of 79, right after you had purchased things. So those of us that fall saw the hotel and all very much in yellow tape. And then Kathy and I worked at family camp as staff. We're both in Mont shirts. This is from 2004. And loved it. And probably were there 100 times or more before retirement. We're now in Hawaii, so a little far away. And I'm serving part-time as a vicar of Christ Church in Kealakekua. But our love and greetings to everyone, and thank you, Kirk, and all who were participating. It brought back wonderful memories of history lessons from Wilmer Mumma and another Churchill Gibson.
It's great
Thank
to
you.
see you, Dwight and Kathy. Come back.
Thank you. Love to.
We'd love to.
Thank you for that. Did you guys fare okay in those horrendous rains a couple of weeks ago or 10 days ago? Hawaii, did you?
Yeah.
Okay?
We did just fine where we are. I mean, it's raining right now and we've had plenty of rain, but we're not in a flood area.
Glad you could join us tonight. There was as I saw people register and they would share some of their memories, many, mostly women talked about their women ancestors, female ancestors serving as waitresses in the 30s and 40s at Mont. That was a large activity. And Cynthia Sumner is raising her hand that's maybe the case. Well, thank you so much. Cynthia, did you have another question or observation?
Yes, I just to say,
Your signal is interrupted. Hang in there. Wow. I don't know if other folks can hear what you're saying, but your signal hung up, Cynthia. I'm sorry. And I have you.
well. My cousin Barbara, who's on the screen, her mother Reba Hepner Dellinger also served as a waitress in the 1930s there, as well as some of our cousins. And our grandfather, Russell Dellinger, would pick up people at the Mount Jackson train station and take them over in his car to Orkney Springs. So it was a family affair. Our Aunt Evelyn also was a waitress there, Evelyn Market.
Was this at the hotel or at Shrine Mont?
It was at the hotel.
How many people on the screen now waited tables at Shrine Mont? I can see several people I know who've done that. That's where I met him.
Wow. And I went to band camp for a couple of years in the 1970s at Orkney as well.
Were you with Falls Church?
No, I went to Hammond High School in Alexandria, Virginia, and we went to band camp at Orkney Springs.
I did not know Hammond did. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Dennis, you're muted.
Thank you, Barbara. I actually lost the signal and came back. Some people wish you hadn't made that observation, maybe, but at any rate, I see other hands, but let me share first. We have some people earning graduate credits now in history. First, Cynthia, who's in with Bill, it may be McKinney, don't see the whole name right there. But Karen Lee, I'm going to tap on it, it'll be here, said, found a grave, Peter Higgins grave site And it was in here before. Here we go. Karen Lee Connor, I'm sorry, is it?
Canair.
Oh, posted Peter Higgins buried in Newmarket, St. Matthew's Cemetery. The dates on his Gibson's gravestone, 8 February 1755 to 28 September 1808. So he passed at about the time he did his sketch of the lots around the town square at Orkney Springs. Well, thank you for that.
Well, we didn't hear much about him.
All right, so yeah, appreciate that. That's excellent. Okay, let's see. Somebody else had a hand up. I overlooked. Let me go. Okay, I can see right now. Barbara, go ahead. And we'll get the others. We'll get the others later.
Hi. My father gave me letters from my third great grandfather who was in the Civil War, and he lived in Orkney Springs. I just recently found that out from a census document I found. So I've been trying to figure out whereabouts he might have lived there. He died during the war, and then his wife and children moved into Connickville. But anyway,
What was his name?
David Ross.
David Ross.
If it's purchased property, Barbara, to my knowledge, if there was a deed involved, you should be able to find that at our circuit court clerk's records in Woodstock. It is, it's at Court and Main Streets. It is the brick building.
Yeah, I know where it's at, definitely.
Anybody want to update or correct my statement about the deeds and land records? Want to make sure
I will
it's straight.
definitely look. I do a lot of work on Ancestry, and I just haven't come across anything yet.
And
Well, I would look at the tax records.
Yeah.
Okay.
And if
Thank you.
if you are in or near that building on a Friday or Saturday between 11 a.m. and 4 p.m., please cross the street to the original historic courthouse and visit our courthouse museum, Historical Society.
Okay.
Staffs, no admission charge.
Awesome.
Okay, let's see. Yes, Ron?
The 1860 census gives Orkney Springs as a district, but it's a very large area.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it does show the people on both sides of where he was living. I can't think of their names off the top of my head, but I know that's going to help me narrow in.
Great to discover that stuff. Let me go to another screen. Many people on my screen number 2 do not have their videos on, so I can't.
Ron, you have to get.
What, Dennis, I see Roger Brown on screen 1 has his hand raised.
Well, when my Historic Society president says there's someone yes, go ahead, Roger Brown.
Hi, it's Roger Bowen. Greetings, everybody. Sure. Thanks for this. What a great evening. Learning a lot, and great job, Kirk. You're a walking encyclopedia there. I served as chaplain after Kirk's dad, and my family lived in the rectory for a number of years too. But I've always wondered, did the folks who came to the hotel in the early years, the late 1800s, think there were medicinal value to the springs there? Do they drink it in that way?
Oh my gosh, yes.
What do you know? Tell me about that, and then say more about the ram pump too, and the water that came to Shrinemount that way.
My understanding is that really it was the medicinal qualities of the water that really started bringing people long before they built the new hotel in the 1830s, and they kept on coming back. When the hotel was fully operational, they had a number of springs down near where the Bear Wallow pump is now. They had the soaking spring, the sulfur spring, the Bear Wallow spring, which had high quantities of magnesium and arsenic to cure most of anything.
The first one is okay, the second one's not.
Yeah, well, the right mix. And so there were a number, and then there were soaking tubs where we now have our bookstore in the old Commonwealth room at one point in the Virginia House. People paid $0.25 to soak in those tubs. So lots of people came for the medicinal qualities, and the New York Times actually wrote a couple of pieces about how they compared to some of the European spring resorts in terms of waters.
Professor Mumon wanted to amplify.
When the swimming pool was first built, and I think around 1900, they piped the spring water into the pool, and they were very, very happy that it was smelly and rusty and had all sorts of wonderful medicinal qualities.
And again, the mountain that we know as Shrine Mountain at one time was called Yellow Spring Mountain also.
Now, now about the ram pump that Roger brings up, the original source of water for the hotel was actually Kelly Spring, which is behind the Maryland House. And at some point they shifted it over to when they acquired a lease with the National Forest or whoever owned that land before the National Forest to bring water over from what's called Seven Springs. And that's about a mile south of Orkney Springs. And that's a much cleaner, much more pure drinkable water. And back in the day, they used to, they had an old iron trough that would carry the water from the springs closer to the road where a big cistern sat. It would dump into that cistern through a window screen, and that was the filtration system, and go down a 3-inch pipe to a hydraulic pump that was self-propelled. And that hydraulic ram would then squirt from the 3-inch pipe the water into a 1-inch pipe up to a holding tank above the hotel. And that served as the water source for the hotel, not for Shrinemont. And then when Shrinemont acquired the hotel property, the first thing they did was incorporate that water system, having to remove all the trough and the ram and put in health department required pumps and underground pipes to give Shrinemont that much better, cleaner spring water than what we had up on the mountain.
Well, we wish you knew more about that, Kirk, but thanks for sharing what you knew. I would I observe also that, let's see, regarding the attractiveness of the springs and when people came, the earliest published, widely available history of the county and the valley that I'm aware of is Samuel Kercheval. He published a history of the Shenandoah Valley. I think the first edition was roundabout 1832, plus or minus a couple of years. It had 5 editions, and he mentions in there folks using the Orkney Springs as a resort. So, and I'd like to back up. I saw a hand also. Patricia Cadle said we have a few Falls Church High School band alumni here who I think that means went to band camp there. Go Jaguars! Not that. Just a random thought, but show about the many, many connections. Our best man for our wedding, Rose and my wedding, was in 1962. Jaguar, right? He played trombone, Royce Lee Gibbons. Thanks for listening to that. Anyway, all those connections. Who had their hand up? Someone else. I don't remember which room. Anybody sees a screen where a hand is raised? We'll get to that. And for some reason, all the people on screen 2, only 3 of them have a video link going. It's not required. Okay. Is Bird the man who had the home near Stony Creek Church? Bird Mumaw? There's a grandfather. Okay, I looked up Seven Springs. This is Cynthia shares with us many times. Grandfather Bird Mumaw. Okay, we got a Mumaw family question. Is that a man who lived near Stony Creek Church? Is this a stumper? It's our first stumper.
Ron?
Not the same person.
Okay, thanks for that information. Again, we are recording this session, and other than my corny joke once in a while, it's all gone, I think, quite well. And thanks, Kirk. We will post up the video wherever we can. Let's just look up one more time on our chat. Okay, I think we took care of that. Again, if you hear from any of your friends or associates that they couldn't find this live on Facebook, that's absolutely true. It's because we didn't fully understand the technology. Facebook has changed some of its requirements on its end. We will go to school on that. Please to visit the websites for both of our organizations, shrinemont.com and Shenandoah County Historical Society, which is SCHS 1795.com, Lots of good information there. And we humbly ask you to, once you've enjoyed the information there and on our Facebook page, to consider becoming a member. In my opinion, it's a real bargain. I'll get corrected here. We just had to, we increased slightly our membership fees. We do electronic newsletter. I'm out on a limb here. Is it $20 a year right now for individual?
Dennis, it's it's $20 a year if you get a paper copy of the newsletter, and it's $15 a year if you do an electronic copy of the newsletter.
And Janet Lee Wagner, our
Oh yes, Janet.
editor,
Janet.
our editor is here with us tonight. I think it's an amazing job she's done on our newsletter.
Yes. Jan Wag. We'll have a newsletter coming out in the next couple of weeks. And I want to say, for all of the board members, thank you all very much for attending tonight. Thank you so much. It was great.
Thank you again so much for Kirk Churchill Gibson IV, and we had Edgar Lama III as our videographer. Great work, and the photos from his sister Cynthia DeLauder. And so we did have a fifth involved and a third involved. We just didn't have a fourth for bridge. I wish you all the best of health. And come to go to see Shrine Mont. The regular opening is April 1st or
April 9th.
April 9th.
April 9th this year.
Thank you for being with us tonight. I've enjoyed doing this, and everybody stay well.
Thank you.
Good job. Thank you very much.
You're all very welcome.
Stay well.
Thank you.
Good night.
Excellent.
Good night.
Bye-bye.